It started on a gray Tuesday morning, March 14th, 1978, in the small town of Riverbend, Illinois. The sun hadn't yet broken through the clouds when two men in leather jackets and mirrored helmets parked their black motorcycles outside of Merrick Jewelers on Main Street. Security footage didn't exist then, only the memories of a sleepy clerk and a woman buying a silver bracelet. At 9:02 a.m., the men walked in. By 9:06, the store alarm was screaming, glass was everywhere, and $4.5 million worth of diamonds and cash had vanished. The robbers were later described as methodical, silent, and quick, like professionals who'd done it before. One of them held a small revolver, but never fired. The other moved with the precision of someone timing each second. When the police arrived, the two bikes were already racing out of town, engines howling through the back roads that led toward the forested outskirts. Witnesses later said the riders disappeared behind a ridge, and then nothing. No one saw where they went, and no one ever saw them again. 10 kilometers north of Riverbend, both motorcycles were found by a rural road near an old grain silo, their fuel tanks ruptured, frames bent. No skid marks, no footprints, just the metallic stench of oil and something else like burned fabric. The cash and jewels were gone. Investigators couldn't find any blood, no helmets, no tire trails leading away. It was as if the riders had evaporated into thin air. Archive note: photo labeled Site B, Silo Perimeter, March 14th, 78, 12:37 p.m., shows two Harley-Davidsons wrecked on damp soil, both license plates removed. Sheriff Don Hall, a man in his 50s with gray stubble and a permanent scowl, led the search. They couldn't have just vanished, he muttered to reporters that afternoon. But day after day, his men combed the woods, the rivers, the farms, and found nothing. Not even a torn glove. Inside the store, forensic teams cataloged fragments of broken glass and a single drop shell casing from a .38 revolver that hadn't been fired. The casing was clean, too clean, like it had been planted. Hall began to suspect something larger. You don't just steal $4.5 million and vanish unless someone helps you, he told his deputy. And that's when rumors started about inside men, corrupt cops, and a third bike seen leaving town. But there was no proof, only whispers. By summer, the case had gone cold. The FBI took brief interest, then withdrew, calling it a localized operation, likely cross-border criminals. Riverbend went back to sleep, though the jewelry store never reopened. Across the decade that followed, the robbery became local folklore, parents warning kids to stay away from the silo where the bikers disappeared. Transcript: 1978 police radio log, 9:27 a.m., Officer 12, got two bikes down by the old Cooper Mill Road. No movement. Dispatch: any sign of riders? Officer 12, negative. Helmet's gone. Tracks end at the fence line. It's like they walked into the cornfield and never came out. The lead detective back then, Frank Melrose, stayed haunted by the case. In later interviews, he said he often dreamed of the field behind the silo, a sea of golden corn hiding something unspeakable beneath. But as months turned into years, memories blurred, witnesses moved away, and files gathered dust. Then came the letter. In October 1983, 5 years after the heist, the Riverbend Gazette received a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a short note typed on yellow paper. It buried the truth with the bikes. Look closer on a grain. It was signed RH, initials that matched no known suspect. Sheriff Hall, already retired, dismissed it as a prank, but Melrose didn't. He went back to the old site with a metal detector and 2 volunteers. Beneath the collapsed remains of the grain silo floor, they found something unexpected: a rusted revolver wrapped in oilcloth, a driver's license under the name Daniel Hurst, and a silver ring with initials ML. The license photo showed a man in his 30s, buzz cut, eyes sharp. But no such person existed in local records. The name was false, but the fingerprints, partially preserved, belonged to a real man. Michael Lawton, a truck mechanic from St. Paul who'd vanished 6 months before the robbery. That discovery reframed everything. The two bikers weren't local crooks. They were ghosts wearing other men's names. Archive: FBI memo, 1983. Subject identified as M. Lawton, presumed deceased. Possible link to organized theft ring North Run, active across Midwest. Recommend reopening Riverbend case. But the investigation hit bureaucratic walls. Evidence was misplaced. The revolver disappeared from storage. Someone didn't want the case reopened. In 1984, Melrose filed a complaint about evidence tampering. A week later, his house was broken into. Only his personal case notes were taken. They knew what they were after, he said in a 1986 interview. They weren't robbers, they were cleaners. By the late 80s, Riverbend had changed. The gas station was gone, replaced by a strip mall. The old police station burned down in '87. The robbery was a ghost story, until one humid morning in August 1988, a hiker named Corey Danner stumbled upon a human skull near the dried riverbed east of town. The jawbone had a gold filling, and beside it lay a decayed leather jacket patch reading Merrick MC. Investigators compared dental records. It matched a missing man from 1978 named Jack Merrick, the very owner of the jewelry store that had been robbed. But Merrick was supposed to be the victim, not a participant. Archive, autopsy note, August 16, '88, remains consistent with male, mid-40s. Gunshot wound to back of head, execution style. Suddenly, the story twisted again. What if Merrick had staged the robbery? The insurance payout had been massive, $5 million. And though authorities seized his assets back then, he declared bankruptcy and disappeared soon after. Now his body was found half a mile from where the bikes were dumped. He didn't vanish with them, Melrose said in a recorded call. He was their insurance man, not their leader. But then who killed him? And where did the other two men go? The discovery of Merrick's corpse reignited the case. The FBI returned, older files reopened. Photographs were re-examined with new techniques, and one image stood out, a blurry shape behind the silo fence. A truck tire mark, faint but distinctive, leading away toward the woods. Forensic analysts traced the pattern to a 1977 Ford F-150, dark green. In the Riverbend DMV archives, only 3 such vehicles were registered that year. One belonged to a man named Robert Hale, a former town councilman and close friend of Sheriff Hall. When questioned in 1988, Hale denied involvement. "I sold that truck in '79, he said. Don't even remember who bought it. But an old mechanic recalled fixing the same truck 2 years after that, still in Hale's name. The circle was tightening. And then something else surfaced. A strip of Super 8 film found in the attic of an abandoned farmhouse near the crime site. It showed fragments of the day of the robbery, 2 bikes, a car idling behind them, and a man in a white shirt waving them forward. The face was grainy, but familiar to anyone who'd lived in Riverbend in the late '70s. Sheriff Hall himself. Transcript. Recovered audio. Tape B. 1978. Male voice 1. They'll be there in 3 minutes. Male voice 2. Raspy, make sure the truck's ready. Male voice 1. Hall said no one will check that road. The voice wasn't confirmed as Hall's, but the cadence was eerily similar. The evidence pointed toward a staged disappearance, a robbery orchestrated with local law enforcement cover. When confronted, Hall refused interviews. He died 2 months later of heart failure before formal charges could be filed. The town never got answers. The cash was never found. Yet in a locked evidence box marked Merrick 1978, one undeveloped roll of film remained. It was rediscovered in 1989 by a new detective, Lisa Conrad, who decided to process it despite the case being closed. The photos revealed something chilling. 2 men loading sacks into the back of a green pickup, one of them glancing straight at the camera, a scar above his left eyebrow. It wasn't Hall. It was Melrose. The detective who'd spent a decade chasing the ghosts may have been one of them all along. If you want to know what they found next, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. When the second investigation opened in late 1988, Riverbend had become a town that didn't want to remember. Half of Main Street was boarded up, and Merrick Jewelers had been turned into a laundromat that few people used. Detective Lisa Conrad was 34, sharp, and unafraid of ghosts. She wasn't from Riverbend. She'd been sent by the State Bureau after inconsistencies were found in the old files. When she first entered the evidence room, the air smelled of mildew and forgotten cases. The box labeled Merrick 1978 was sitting on the lowest shelf, its tape brittle, corners darkened by time. Inside were photographs, the revolver report, and a sealed envelope marked "Do not reopen without authorization." She opened it anyway. Inside were 10 black and white photographs from that undeveloped roll. The frames captured the morning of March 14th, 1978. The two motorcycles by the store, the green pickup idling near the alley, and in the background, a man wearing a sheriff's jacket watching from the corner. But the next two frames changed everything. One showed the same truck parked by the old silo hours later, headlights off, tailgate down. The second showed a hand reaching toward the camera as if trying to block it. The timestamp printed by the camera read 10:27 a.m., 1 hour after the robbery. Whoever took those photos had been there, close enough to see everything. Conrad leaned back in her chair, realizing the photographer had probably been killed for what they saw. She requested the original negatives and found partial fingerprints on the film edges belonging to a woman named Sarah Danner, the hiker's mother, who had died in 1981 in what had been ruled a car accident. The coincidences began to pile up, and Conrad's instincts told her the entire decade of silence had been maintained by force. She reopened interviews with everyone still alive, retired deputies, store clerks, even Merrick's estranged sister in St. Paul. Most refused to talk. One old deputy, George Finch, finally agreed to meet at a diner off Highway 9. His hands trembled as he stirred his coffee. "You shouldn't dig into this," he told her quietly. Hall wasn't the only one taking orders. There was a man from Chicago. Name starts with R. He funded it. The jewels were never meant to stay in Riverbend. Conrad pressed him, but Finch wouldn't say more. 2 days later, he was found dead in his trailer. Carbon monoxide leak, officially. But his phone record showed a call to an unlisted number 20 minutes before. The name associated with it, Robert Hale. The same man whose truck had been seen in the film. Conrad drove to Hale's farmhouse that night. The property looked abandoned, windows boarded, grass waist high. But the mailbox still had fresh mail inside. She knocked twice. No answer. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a living room coated in dust, walls lined with old newspaper clippings about the 1978 robbery. One photo on the mantel froze her in place. A group of men smiling beside motorcycles. Hall, Hale, and a third man with the same scar above his eyebrow as Melrose. The caption read, "Riverbend Charity Ride, Summer 1977. Melrose had been in it from the start. Conrad drove back to the precinct, her pulse racing. She pulled Melrose's personnel file from archives. It was spotless, too spotless. Commendations, no reprimands, a quiet retirement in 1987, last known address. Lakeside Cabin, Marlow County. She requested a search warrant, but before it came through, she went there herself. The cabin was small, overlooking a frozen lake. A light was on inside. She stepped quietly onto the porch, her hand near her sidearm. Through the window, she saw Melrose, older, gaunt, sitting at a table covered with photographs and whiskey bottles. He was talking to himself. Conrad knocked. Melrose looked up, startled, then motioned her in. "I figured someone would come eventually," he said, voice rasped. "You're from the Bureau, right? You saw the pictures." She nodded. "Then you already know," he muttered. "We didn't plan for it to end like that." Conrad turned on her recorder. "Tell me what happened, Mr. Melrose." He stared at the lake. "Merrick was broke. He came to Hall first. Hall came to me, said we could make it look real. A robbery, quick, no one hurt. 2 guys from out of state would handle it, then disappear. We'd split the insurance money later. But the night before the job, things changed. The Chicago man wanted it done for real. No insurance scam, just a hit. Merrick had borrowed from the wrong people. The jewels were collateral. They told us to get rid of him after." Conrad felt a chill crawl up her spine. "And you did." Melrose shook his head. "I didn't pull the trigger. Hale did, out by the river. Then he took the cash and buried part of it under the old grain silo. Said he'd come back when it cooled off." Conrad leaned forward. "Why didn't you report it?" "You don't report men like that," he said quietly. Hale wasn't working alone. The FBI contact on the case was dirty too. They shut it down before it reached Chicago. He poured another drink, hands trembling. I tried to disappear. Then Hall died, and I thought it was over. But Hale, he kept digging up ghosts. He killed Finch last week, didn't he? Conrad said nothing. You're in danger, he said. If you found me, he knows too. That night, Conrad left with a single envelope Melrose gave her. Inside were coordinates scribbled on a napkin and a key marked silo locker. He told her it was the last piece of the story. The next morning, she called him back up to search the site. But by the time they arrived, Melrose's cabin was on fire. His body was found inside, burned beyond recognition. The coroner ruled an accident. Conrad didn't believe it for a second. Following the coordinates, she reached the ruins of the old grain silo. Beneath a slab of concrete, they uncovered a rusted metal locker chained shut. Inside was a plastic bag containing water-damaged cash bundles, a few loose diamonds, and a single audio cassette labeled March 15th, 1978, final. She took it back to the lab. When they played it, the tape hissed with static, then a man's voice spoke. It was Merrick. If you hear this, something went wrong. They said it was just insurance, but I think they're going to kill me. If they find this, I'm dead already. Hall knows. Hale's truck is waiting behind the silo. Please, tell my sister not to trust anyone from Riverbend. The tape cut off with a sound like a door slamming. For Conrad, that was enough. She prepared an arrest warrant for Hale, but the morning it was issued, he was gone. His truck was found near the river, engines still warm, footprints leading into the woods. They never found him. Weeks passed, and the state ordered the case sealed again. Too many names, too much dust, her supervisor said. Let's stay buried. But Conrad didn't. She sent copies of every file to the Department of Justice anonymously. Then she resigned. Years later, in 1993, a hiker found a rusted handgun half buried in mud near the same woods. The serial number matched the revolver that had vanished from evidence in 1983. Nearby were human remains later identified as Robert Hale. A single bullet hole in the skull. It looked like suicide, but there was no gunshot residue on his hand. Whoever killed him wanted it to look clean. In Hale's wallet, preserved by the mud, was a photograph. Him, Hall, Melrose, and Merrick, all smiling beside a table stacked with jewelry boxes. On the back was written, March 12, 1978, the plan. After that discovery, the truth finally made sense. The robbery had been an inside job from the beginning, planned by Merrick to fake his own theft and erase debts, backed by Hall and Hale, covered by Melrose, and destroyed when greed overtook loyalty. When the deal with Chicago's financiers soured, they turned on each other. Hale executed Merrick to silence him, burned the getaway trail, and spent years killing anyone who got close. Melrose hid his guilt behind the badge, tried to atone by exposing Hale, but died before he could. And Hall, the man meant to protect the town, had built its greatest lie. Conrad's report never reached the public officially. It was filed, stamped, forgotten, but copies leaked through journalists years later, forming the basis of a small documentary called The Riverbend Heist. Locals watched in silence as the film replayed the crime with real photos and voices. At the end, Conrad's narration asked one question. If everyone involved is dead, who took the jewels that remained? Because in the evidence locker, there had only been $600,000 in recovered cash, barely a fraction of the $4.5 million stolen. Someone still had the rest. In 1998, a Chicago pawn shop reported a customer selling vintage diamonds traced to Merrick Jewelers' inventory list. The man was never caught on camera, but the clerk described him as late 30s, scar above his eyebrow. Melrose should have been over 60 by then. The sighting reignited speculation that he had faked his death, leaving behind a burned body planted in his cabin. FBI handwriting analysts compared his past notes to a letter found in 2001 at a used bookstore in Milwaukee, a confession addressed to LC that ended with, "We took what we could carry." The rest is in the ground where it all began. The letter was signed M.L. Conrad, now long retired, was interviewed one last time for the re-release of the documentary in 2005. When asked if she believed Melrose was alive, She paused for a long time before answering. Alive? Maybe once. But people like him, they die long before the body does. He carried that guilt for 10 years. I think he wanted to disappear more than he wanted to live. The host asked her what she thought happened to the missing money. Conrad smiled faintly. I think it's still out there, and I think someone's already found it. In 2010, construction workers unearthed a sealed metal box while rebuilding the old Riverbend Bridge. Inside were 30 diamond stones wrapped in a leather pouch and a single photograph. Lisa Conrad shaking hands with the mayor during the case closure ceremony in 1989. On the back, thank for finishing what we started. M. No fingerprints, no DNA, no trace of origin. The diamonds were returned to state custody, and the case was finally declared closed. But to this day, residents still whisper that on foggy mornings near the river, the sound of two engines can be heard revving in the distance, fading into the woods just like in 1978. Maybe echoes, maybe guilt, or maybe someone making sure the town never forgets. What do you think? Was justice ever truly served, or did Riverbend just bury another secret? Leave your thoughts in the comments.